June 15, 1859. On a quiet island in the Pacific Northwest, an American farmer stepped outside his small wooden cabin and noticed something that had been bothering him for weeks. A large black pig was digging through his potato patch. Again, the farmer had spent months growing those crops, and this wasn't the first time the animal had wandered onto his land. Frustrated and fed up, he grabbed his rifle. One shot rang out across the field. The pig collapsed in the dirt. At first glance, this looked like nothing more than a minor dispute between neighbors. But within weeks, that single gunshot would bring American soldiers to the island, British warships sailing into the harbor, and thousands of armed men preparing for battle. For a brief moment in history, the United States and the British Empire stood dangerously close to war, all because of one very unlucky pig. Today, the story sounds almost ridiculous. But in 1859, the United States and Britain were two expanding global powers. Both nations had strong military forces and major interests in North America. If fighting had broken out, it wouldn't have stayed confined to one small island in the Pacific. A battle between American soldiers and British naval forces could easily have escalated into a much larger conflict between the two countries. And the strangest part of all? The entire crisis began with a simple question. Who actually owned the land where that pig had been standing? Because the truth was, no one was completely sure. The roots of the crisis go back to 1846, when the United States and Britain signed the Oregon Treaty. For years, both nations had claimed the massive region known as the Oregon Territory. American settlers were traveling west along the Oregon Trail in growing numbers, while British trading companies had already built strong economic networks throughout the region. To prevent the situation from turning into a larger war, the two countries agreed to divide the territory peacefully. The border would follow the 49th parallel, the same line that still separates much of the United States and Canada today. But when the border reached the Pacific Ocean, the treaty became vague. Instead of drawing a precise line, it simply said the border would pass through the middle of the channel, separating Vancouver Island from the mainland. At the time, the maps of the region weren't very accurate, and there turned out to be two possible channels that could match that description. One was the Rosario Strait, the other was the Haro Strait. Depending on which channel you chose, the border would fall on completely different sides of a small cluster of islands. Right in the middle of those islands was San Juan Island. Both Britain and the United States believed the island belonged to them, and for years, neither side was willing to back down. During the early 1850s, settlers began arriving on San Juan Island. American farmers moved there first, hoping to claim land and build small farms. Not long after, the British established their own presence. The powerful Hudson's Bay Company, which dominated the fur trade in the region, created a large sheep ranch on the island. At its peak, thousands of sheep grazed across the rolling fields. The ranch was managed by a British employee named Charles Griffin. Before long, the island had two communities living side by side, American farmers clearing land and planting crops, and British ranch workers managing livestock for the Hudson's Bay Company. Both groups believed the island belonged to their country. Most of the time, they managed to coexist peacefully, but tensions slowly began to build. There was no clear border, no agreed government, and no official authority that both sides recognized, which meant even small disagreements could quickly turn into political disputes. And one of the most common sources of conflict involved animals wandering across farms. One of the American settlers on the island was a farmer named Lyman Cutler. Cutler had built a small homestead and planted a garden full of potatoes. But there was a recurring problem. One of Charles Griffin's pigs kept wandering onto his land. Over and over again, the animal dug through the soil and destroyed his crops. Cutler complained several times. But the pig kept coming back. Then, on the morning of June 15, 1859, the pig returned once again. It wandered straight into the garden and started digging up the potatoes. This time, Cutler had finally had enough. He grabbed his rifle and fired. The pig died instantly. At first, the situation seemed like it could be solved with a simple payment. Cutler even offered to compensate Griffin for the loss. But when Griffin demanded $100, Cutler refused. He argued the pig wasn't worth nearly that much and offered $10 instead. The disagreement quickly escalated into a serious argument. Soon British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler for killing the pig, and suddenly the dispute wasn't about livestock anymore. It had become a question of who had legal authority on the island. But before we continue, a quick note about the music you're hearing in this video. I use epidemic sound for all the music and sound effects in my videos. They have thousands of cinematic tracks, historical ambience, and sound effects that make storytelling videos like this possible. If you're making YouTube videos, documentaries, or any kind of storytelling content, it's one of the easiest ways to get high-quality music without worrying about copyright claims. If you want to check it out, there's a link in the description. Now back to the story. Because by the summer of 1859, that dead pig had already triggered a serious international crisis. The American settlers were alarmed. If the British arrested Cutler, it would suggest that Britain had legal control over the island. So they contacted the United States military for protection. Their request reached General William S. Harney, the commander of American forces in the region. Harney already distrusted British intentions and saw the situation as an opportunity to assert American control. He ordered Captain George Pickett to sail to San Juan Island with troops. In July 1859, Pickett arrived with 66 American soldiers. They quickly established a military camp and declared they would defend American settlers from British interference. From the American perspective, they were protecting their citizens. But from the British perspective, American troops had just occupied British territory. The British response came quickly. Warships from the Royal Navy sailed toward the island. Soon several powerful ships anchored offshore. Their cannons pointed toward the American camp. More ships followed. At the height of the crisis, 5 British warships carrying over 2,000 sailors and Marines surrounded San Juan Island. Meanwhile, fewer than 70 American soldiers stood on the island. At this point, the situation looked incredibly dangerous. One wrong move could have started a battle. The British naval commander even suggested landing troops and forcing the Americans off the island. But the governor of Vancouver Island hesitated. He reportedly said he would not start a war between two great nations over a pig. Meanwhile, Captain Pickett refused to leave. He declared that if the British attacked, his soldiers would make another Bunker Hill. For weeks, the two sides watched each other. American soldiers stood guard on the island. British warships waited in the harbor. But instead of gunfire, diplomacy finally stepped in. When news of the crisis reached Washington and London, leaders in both governments were shocked. Neither country wanted a war over a remote island. The United States sent General Winfield Scott, one of the most respected officers in the army, to negotiate with the British. Scott proposed a compromise. Instead of fighting, both countries would jointly occupy the island. American troops would remain on one side. British Royal Marines would establish their own camp on the other. Surprisingly, the arrangement worked. For the next 12 years, both armies lived peacefully on San Juan Island. They visited each other's camps, held social events, and sometimes even played sports together. It became one of the strangest military standoffs in history. The border dispute remained unresolved until 1872, when both nations asked a neutral third party to settle the issue. The decision went to Kaiser Wilhelm IV of Germany. After reviewing the maps and treaty documents, the Commission ruled that the border should follow the Haro Strait. That meant San Juan Island officially belonged to the United States. British troops withdrew peacefully, ending the strange standoff. Looking back, the Pig War sounds almost unbelievable. Two powerful nations, warships ready for battle, soldiers preparing for a fight, all triggered by one pig wandering into the wrong potato field. But the story also shows something important. Sometimes the difference between war and peace comes down to restraint, patience, and diplomacy. In the end, the Pig War became one of history's strangest conflicts, where the only casualty was the pig.